let's take a look at flooding. Now, floods are one of the most common environmental hazards. We see them, we hear about them, we hear about the destruction of them on the news or on TV. So it's important to understand how and why floods happen. So most urban areas, like cities, are actually equipped to handle small floods. However, not the low frequency, high magnitude events. These are the floods that you may hear every now and then. It's called the 100-year flood. And this happens around every 100 years. And there's something called a recurrence interval. Now this is the regularity of a flood of a given size, such as small floods that are expected to occur regularly, while larger floods occur less often. So recently, in the past few years, we've heard a lot about the Midwest floods, and these have been devastating. This is where the Mississippi River overflows, and other parts of the Midwest also have just flooded tremendously. The areas are not equipped to handle this, and it's typical for the Mississippi to do this. However, most urban areas are not equipped to handle these types of events, these really high magnitude events. Now, there's the nature and scale of flooding varies across the globe. For example, less than 2% of the population in England, Wales, and Australia are actually exposed to flooding. This is partly due to the climate. They're also more equipped to handle floods of any small size. 10% of the population in the U.S. is actually exposed to flooding. And this, if you look at the entire nation as a whole, this is actually a pretty large number. Now, if we take a look at Asia, specifically China, these are where floods actually happen a lot. So floods damage 4 million hectares of land in Asia. Now, this affects about 17 million people. 5 million people were killed in China by floods since 1860. So if we take a look at these numbers, Asia and some of the less developed countries around the globe, or the developing countries, actually get hit by floods much differently than places that are actually already economically developed, like the United States, England, places like that. So there are some environments that are especially at risk when we talk about flooding. These are the low-lying parts of active floodplains and river estuaries. So if we were to be living along the banks of the Mississippi River, for example, or the Nile River, we would be in an environment that is extremely high risk. Any type of river that you live next to is actually a high risk. This is one of the reasons why, if we were to live in along the Peace River, the Manatee River, these are places that your flood insurance is probably exceptionally high. Small basins that are subject to flash flood are also environments that are at high risk. Areas below unsafe dams, and low-lying inland shorelines. Now, if you think of even the shorelines, even though it's not a fluvial system, here in Sarasota we have areas that are definitely low-lying shorelines up against the ocean, and not so much fluvial, but we can discuss the same kinds of floodings, if you think about it, in Sarasota due to ocean flooding versus fluvial or river flooding. Now, you heard me discuss China and Asia as being less economically developed. We actually see two terms, and you will see this throughout the course when we start talking about some of the more or less economically developed countries. When we hear the term MEDC, we are talking about more economically developed countries. These are basically areas that, like the United States, Canada, Australia, England, parts of mostly all of Europe. These are places that have been around for much longer amounts of time, are fairly stable in their economic development. And the MEDCs, if we look at the number of deaths from floods, they're actually decreasing. However, the cost of the flooding is actually increasing. So deaths are handled much differently in more economically developed countries. However, the cost to fix those areas that are flooded because of flood damage are increasing. In our less economically developed countries, our LEDCs, the number of deaths from flooding are increasing. However, the cost of that flood damage is not as great. Part of this is also because in these areas that are flooding, they're not developed economically, like in large cities or urban cities that they are in those MEDCs. Now, there are causes of flooding as well, and there's two main causes of flooding. The first one are climatic conditions, and I mentioned that in a couple slides earlier. In areas that have monsoon seasons or areas of low pressure systems, we're going to be talking about two of these when we talk about the atmosphere pretty soon in the next topic. However, the climatic conditions cause flooding. So especially during monsoon seasons. In the United States, we have monsoon seasons in Arizona. In certain places around like Thailand and in Asia, they have monsoon seasons, and that's a huge cause for flooding. Low pressure systems. Now, if we talk about low pressure systems, think of hurricanes and think of big storms. So big storms are caused by low pressure systems. So once these areas of low pressure come into an area, it can dump a lot of rain, thus causing a lot of flooding, depending upon where it's going. Another cause would also be flood intensifying conditions. So these are very specific to drainage basins. So if we're talking about, let's say, New Orleans. New Orleans is an area where flood conditions can be intensified tremendously, partly because New Orleans lies below sea level. And this is the reason for all the levees around. But specifically in other areas, if we're talking about drainage specific areas, we have to first look at the topography, kind of what does the land look like? We have to look at soil type. Is it clay? Is it gravel? Is it different kinds of sand? So this also includes whether or not it's going to be a cause for flooding. Vegetation. Do we have a lot of vegetation? No vegetation? Small vegetation? We have to take a look at that. And rock type as well. Now this and soil type sort of go together. They go hand in hand. Now the potential for damage by floodwaters actually increase exponentially with velocity. So the faster those floodwaters, basically the more damage that we're going to see. So keep this in mind, and this is kind of the same, it runs true for any kind of fluvial system. The faster it is, the more erosion that's going to happen. Same with damage. If we have a high velocity of this water rushing through, it's going to have possibly cause a lot of damage to an area. Now it's really important for you to go back and view figure 1.27 and 1.28 in your textbook. It corresponds to page 31 in your workbook. Now these are two very important figures that show the causes and the flood intensifying conditions for you, and you can write this down. There's a little box in your workbook for you to do this. These figures are actually really nice. They're graphically organized for you instead of just writing them down in note form. Take a look and copy them into your notes because this will help you out in some of your in your discussions about floods.